She was 17 years old, and she had exactly $4.60 to her name, and nowhere in the world that would call itself home. Her stepfather, a hard and joyless man named Elias Crane, had put her out of the house on the morning after her mother's funeral, telling her plainly that a stepdaughter was no kin at all once the woman who bound them was in the ground. What little she carried. She carried in a flour sack, a spare dress, a comb, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and those $4.60, saved coin by coin from selling eggs at the market for 2 summers. With that sack and that sum, she walked to the edge of the town of Belhaven Junction, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1887, and there, rusting on a forgotten spur of track behind the old freight yard, she found a railroad car that the Union Pacific had written off as scrap a decade before. She paid $3 for it. Money enough, the yard foreman told her, for a fool's shelter and nothing more. But sealed within its walls, behind a panel no one had thought to pry loose in 10 years of neglect, was a discovery that would not only change the course of her life, but would restore an entire town that had quietly been dying for want of the very thing hidden there. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Vale. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, we'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Tell us in the comments below. Odessa had been born in 1870 in a soddy on the Nebraska plains, the only child of a homesteading couple who had come west with nothing but a wagon, a plow, and a stubborn belief that the land owed them a living if they were patient enough to ask for it properly. Her father, Thomas Vale, died of a fever when she was 6, and she remembered him mostly as a low voice singing hymns while he worked, and as a pair of hands that showed her, patiently, how to read a compass and how to splint a broken fence rail so it would hold through a Nebraska winter. Her mother, Ruth, was the one who raised her afterward, first alone and then, when Odessa was 11, alongside Elias Crane, an itinerant tinsmith who came through the county mending pots and stayed on to marry the young widow. Ruth had married him. Odessa came to understand later, not for love but for the plain arithmetic of survival. A mother alone with a daughter on the prairie had few enough choices, and Elias at least had a trade in steady hands, even if his heart proved to be a cold and calculating instrument. It was Ruth who gave Odessa the gift that would matter most in the years to come, though neither of them knew it at the time. Ruth had been raised in Pennsylvania, in a family that had worked the railroad since the earliest lines were laid, and her own father had been a dispatcher and later a station master in a small Allegheny town. Ruth had grown up around freight manifests and telegraph keys and the particular language of the rails, and she passed this knowledge to Odessa the way some mothers pass down quilting patterns or recipes, in the evenings, by lamplight, teaching her daughter to read a waybill, to understand the different classes of freight car, to recognize the markings that told you where a car had been built and what roads it had traveled. A railroad car has a whole life of its own. Odessa, Ruth used to say, tracing the stenciled numbers on an old timetable with her finger. It carries things people can't carry themselves. Sometimes it carries more than freight. Odessa did not understand what her mother meant by that last part until many years later, but she never forgot the words, nor the quiet reverence in her mother's voice when she spoke them. Ruth also taught her daughter carpentry, of a rough and practical kind. How to drew a board with a plane, how to read the grain of wood to know where it would split and where it would hold, how to drive a nail so it bit deep and did not bend. This came from necessity as much as inclination. On a homestead, a woman who could not mend her own roof or brace her own barn door was a woman at the mercy of every storm that blew through. Odessa took to the work with an aptitude that surprised even her mother, and by the time she was 14 she could build a sound chicken coop from salvaged lumber without a single wasted board. Elias Crane regarded this skill with a kind of sour amusement, remarking more than once that it was a strange thing for a girl to be handy with a hammer, as though usefulness in his stepdaughter was somehow an affront to the natural order he preferred. The other inheritance Ruth left her daughter was less tangible but no less real, an unshakable conviction that decency was owed to people regardless of their circumstances, and that a person's worth was not measured by the money in their pocket or the cut of their coat. Ruth had seen hard times herself. She had known what it was to be a widow with an empty larder, to accept charity from neighbors and to give it in turn when the roles reversed, and she raised Odessa to believe that kindness was not a luxury for the comfortable but a debt owed by everyone to everyone else, paid out in small installments over the whole of a life. You do not have to have much to give something, Ruth would say. You only have to notice what someone needs. Odessa carried this teaching the way she carried her mother's Bible, close and constant, long after Ruth herself was gone. Ruth Vale Crane died in the spring of 1887 of a lung sickness that had crept up on her slowly through a hard winter, and Odessa nursed her through the worst of it with a tenderness that the neighbors spoke of admiringly for years afterward. Elias Crane, for his part, grew more distant as his wife grew sicker, spending longer hours away from the house on pretense of tin work, and by the time Ruth passed, in April, he had already begun making arrangements, not for a proper mourning, but for the disposition of the small house and the little land that had been Ruth's by her first husband's claim. Odessa learned, in the days after the funeral, that Elias had no legal obligation to her whatsoever, and no inclination either to pretend otherwise. He told her, standing in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, that she was welcome to take what she could carry, and that he expected her gone by morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The coldness of it was worse than any shouting could have been. Odessa left before dawn, while the frost was still silver on the grass, carrying her flour sack and her mother's Bible and the $4.60 that represented the whole of her worldly wealth. She walked the 11 miles to the nearest rail line and road in an open freight car with a handful of other travelers too poor for a passenger ticket, west and north into Wyoming territory, because a woman she'd met at church had once mentioned a cousin in a town called Belhaven Junction who might have worked in a boarding house. The cousin, it turned out, had died the winter before, and the boarding house had long since let its last room. Odessa arrived in Belhaven Junction on a gray October afternoon with nowhere to sleep and no one who knew her name, and it was there, walking the perimeter of the town in the fading light, looking for anywhere she might shelter for the night, that she first saw the railroad car. It sat on a disused spur behind the freight yard, half swallowed by prairie grass gone gold and brittle with the season, its wheels sunk into ground that had not felt the weight of a locomotive in years. It was a boxcow, once painted the deep red-brown common to the Union Pacific's rolling stock, though the paint had long since faded to a mottled rust color that made it look, in that failing light, almost like something grown from the earth rather than built upon it. One sliding door hung open on a broken track, and the other was rusted shut. Odessa approached it the way she approached most things in those days, cautiously, but without fear, because fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. Inside, she found it dry, at least, the roof sound enough to keep out weather, and something about its solidity, its plain and honest bulk, made her feel less alone than she had felt in days. She asked after the next morning at the railroad yard office, where a tired foreman named Hollis Adair told her the car had been condemned years before, its trucks too worn for service, and that the railroad had simply left it to rot on the spur rather than pay to haul it away for scrap. When she asked what it would cost to claim it, he laughed, not unkindly, and said the railroad would likely take $3 just to be rid of the paperwork. Odessa did not laugh. She counted out 3 of her $4.60 on his desk, and Hollis Adair, seeing something in her face that gave him pause, wrote out a bill of sale on railroad stationery and told her the car and the small patch of ground beneath it were his, for whatever that was worth. It was, by any sensible reckoning, a foolish purchase, a woman with 60 cents to her name and a rotting boxcar for a house, and more than one person in Belhaven Junction would say so to her face in the weeks that followed. That first night as a rightful owner of a strange new home, Odessa set about making it livable, sweeping out years of dust and wind-blown debris with a broom fashioned from prairie brush, and it was in this work that she made her first discovery. Running her hand along the interior wall to judge its soundness, the way her mother had taught her to judge a board, she felt a seam that did not belong, a place where the wall's paneling had been fitted and refitted, the nail holes slightly larger than elsewhere, the wood grain interrupted in a manner that spoke of a hand at work long after the car had left the factory. She thought little of it that first night, exhausted as she was, but the memory of that seam stayed with her, the way a splinter stays beneath the skin even when the pain has faded, and she found herself returning to it in her mind over the days that followed, the way her mother's voice returned to her. Sometimes it carries more than freight. It took Odessa nearly 2 weeks, working in the evenings after she had secured a small measure of paid work mending clothes for the women of Belhaven Junction, to work up the courage and find the proper tools to investigate the seam in earnest. She borrowed a pry bar from Hollis Adair, who by then had taken a grandfatherly interest in the strange, capable girl who had claimed the condemned boxcow, and on a cold November evening, by the light of a single tallow candle, she set the bar to the seam and worked it gently, mindful of her mother's teaching that force applied wrongly would only destroy what patience might reveal intact. The panel came away with a groan of old nails surrendering their grip, and behind it, In a cavity built deliberately into the car's structure, she found a metal strongbox, its surface pitted with rust but its hinges, remarkably, still whole. Inside the strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against a decade of Wyoming winters, Odessa found a leather ledger book, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a hand-drawn map showing a section of land some 6 miles north of Belhaven Junction, marked with symbols she did not at first understand. The ledger, when she opened it with trembling hands, proved to be the private accounting of a man named Josiah Bell, the very man, she would soon learn, for whom the town had been named, detailing payments made to workers, deliveries of goods, and a series of entries that spoke of spring, a source of clean water discovered on land north of the town, land that Josiah Bell had quietly purchased and then, for reasons the ledger did not immediately explain, had hidden from the town he had founded. The letters told the rest of the story, though it took Odessa several evenings of careful reading to piece it together fully, her mother's patient habits of mind serving her now as surely as they had served her with wooden nails. Josiah Bell, it emerged, had founded Belhaven Junction in the 1860s as a railroad town, drawing settlers with the promise of the coming line and the reliable water of Willow Creek, which ran along the town's eastern edge. But by the mid-1870s, as the letters and ledger together revealed, Willow Creek's water had begun to sour, tainted by mineral runoff from mining operations upstream, leaving the town's wells increasingly brackish and unfit for drinking or for irrigation of the modest farms that ringed the settlement. Bell, it seemed, had discovered a pure spring on land to the north, the very land marked on the hidden map, a spring fed by deep aquifers untouched by the mining contamination, capable of watering the whole town and its farms besides. But Josiah Bell had not shared this discovery with Belhaven Junction. The letters, written in a hand growing progressively more anxious and secretive, revealed a man caught in the grip of a scheme. He had quietly purchased the spring land under a false name, intending to sell water rights back to his own desperate town at a punishing price once the wells failed entirely, a betrayal of the very people who had trusted him to build a place worth living in. He had hidden the ledger, the letters, and the map inside a railroad car he had commissioned for his personal use, intending, it seemed, to retrieve them once his scheme had matured. But the final letter, dated 1876, spoke of Bell's sudden plans to leave for California, and no further entries followed. Odessa would learn, through careful inquiry at the town clerk's office in the weeks to come, that Josiah Bell had died of a sudden apoplexy before he ever boarded that western train, and the boxcar containing his secret had been decommissioned and forgotten, sitting on its lonely spur while the town he had founded slowly withered for want of the water he had hidden from it. Odessa sat with this knowledge for 3 sleepless nights, understanding with a clarity that frightened her the weight of what she now held. Belhaven Junction, she had already observed in her short time there, was a town in quiet decline. The wells brackish, the farms struggling, families packing their wagons and moving on to greener country with a regularity that spoke of desperation rather than ambition. She had seen the tired lines on the faces of the women whose mending she took in, had heard the men in the mercantile speak in low, worried voices about whether the town would survive another dry summer. She understood now that she held, in a letter ledger and a hand-drawn map, the means to save them. But she understood also that the very land on which that salvation lay was, by the twisted logic of Bell's old scheme, legally hazed a claim, hidden under a false name that only she now knew how to trace. She might have kept the secret. She might have quietly purchased the spring land herself, using whatever means she could scrape together, and sold the water rights to the town at whatever price the market would bear, becoming rich in the very desperation that had driven Josiah Bell to his scheme in the first place. The temptation, she would admit to herself honestly, did cross her mind in the darkest of those 3 sleepless nights, when the arithmetic of her own poverty pressed hard against her conscience. But she remembered her mother's voice, low and certain in the lamplight of their old soddy. You do not have to have much to give something. You only have to notice what someone needs. And so, on the 4th morning, Odessa Vale walked into the office of the Belhaven Junction town clerk, a stooped and careful man named Winslow Pratt, and laid the ledger, the letters, and the map upon his desk. The trouble came, as trouble often does, not from the townspeople themselves, but from a man who saw in the discovery an opportunity for his own advancement. Garrett Thorne was a proprietor of the town's mercantile and, more significantly, held a mortgage on nearly a third of the farms surrounding Belhaven Junction, farms whose owners had borrowed against increasingly poor harvests in years when Willow Creek's water had failed them. Thorne had built his modest empire on the town's slow desperation, and when word of the hidden spring reached him, for such news could not stay contained in a town so small and so hungry for hope, he moved with a speed that revealed how carefully he had already calculated the value of what Odessa had found. He rode to the county land office himself, before Odessa or Winslow Pratt could act, and lodged a claim asserting that the spring land, as an abandoned and unclaimed parcel, rightfully belonged to whoever first properly filed for it under territorial homestead law, a legal maneuver that, though transparently self-serving, was not without some technical merit, since Bell's false name purchase had never been formally transferred to any living heir. What followed was a tense and uncertain fortnight in which Belhaven Junction found itself divided between those who trusted the strange young woman who had arrived with nothing and those who trusted the established merchant who held their debts and, by extension, a measure of their fee. Thorne was not a subtle man once his interests were threatened. He spread word that Odessa Vale was an unknown drifter with a forged story and a stolen map, a girl of no family and no standing who could not possibly be believed over a man of Thorne's long tenure in the community. He offered, publicly and with great show of generosity, to develop the spring himself and pipe its water into town, for a reasonable fee, naturally, to recoup his considerable investment, a fee that Winslow Pratt, doing the arithmetic quietly at his desk, calculated would bind half the farms of Belhaven Junction to Thorne's mortgage book for a generation to come. Odessa did not fight Thorne with anger, though she had cause enough for it, nor did she retreat from the confrontation, though a lesser resolve might have buckled under the weight of a grown man's public scorn. Instead, she did what her mother had taught her to do with a warped board or a stubborn nail. She looked for the grain of the truth and worked with it patiently, rather than against it. She spent her days at the county land office, poring over territorial statutes with Winslow Pratt's patient guidance, learning that Bell's original false name purchase, however irregular, constituted a legal claim that predated any new filing Thorne might lodge, and that as a discoverer and rightful possessor of the documentation proving that claim, she had standing to file on the estate's behalf and, in turn, to petition that the spring be dedicated as common property of the town rather than held by any single owner, herself included. It was a bold and, to some in town, a baffling choice. Winslow Pratt himself gently questioned whether she understood she was surrendering a fortune that might, by any reasonable legal argument, have been hers alone to keep. But Odessa had already made her peace with a decision on that full sleepless morning, and she explained it to the assembled townspeople, when the matter finally came before a public hearing in the schoolhouse in early December, with a plainness that carried more weight than any flowery oratory could have managed. She told them of her mother, and of the lessons learned in the sortie on the Nebraska plains, and of a railroad car that had carried, hidden within its walls for a decade, both a betrayal and the means to undo it. She told them that she had not come to Belhaven Junction to take from it, but that the town, without knowing it, had already given her something she desperately needed, a place to stand, however humble, when she had nowhere else, and that she intended to answer that gift in kind. The hearing that followed Garrett Thorne's counter-argument revealed, with an irony that did not escape anyone present, the true character of the man who had spent a fortnight questioning Odessa's honesty. Winslow Pratt, in preparing the town's case, had quietly examined Thorne's own mortgage records, filed as public documents of the land office, and discovered a pattern of foreclosures timed with suspicious precision to the driest months of each of the past 3 summers, foreclosures that had allowed Thorne to absorb prime farmland at a fraction of its worth from families with nowhere else to turn. This was not the Secret Springs revelation, precisely, but it emerged in the natural course of the hearing's scrutiny as the town's attention turned, for the first time in years, toward examining exactly how its own hardship had been quietly profitable to one of its most trusted citizens. The territorial judge who presided that December day, a circuit-riding magistrate named Homer Callahan, ruled in Odessa's favor on the spring's ownership, and though he had no jurisdiction to punish Thorne for what amounted to hard but technically legal business dealings, the ruling and the scrutiny that accompanied it were enough to see Thorne standing in Belhaven Junction crumble within the season. His mercantile losing custom to a new store that opened the following spring, run by 2 of the very farmers he had once held in his debt. The restoration of Belhaven Junction began in earnest the following spring, once the ground had thawed enough for pipe laying, and Odessa Vale, though she had surrendered any personal claim to the spring's profit, found herself at the center of the effort in a way that suited both her skills and her temperament. She organized the labor of running pipe from the spring 6 miles south into town, drawing on the carpentry and practical engineering her mother had taught her to solve the countless small problems that arose in such an undertaking: how to brace a pipe trench through rocky ground, how to build a simple gravity-fed system that required no costly pump. The men of the town, who had at first regarded a 17-year-old girl directing pipe-laying crews with some skepticism, came within weeks to trust her judgment as thoroughly as they trusted Hollis Adair's, and by midsummer the first clean water in a decade ran from a public well in the center of Belhaven Junction, drawing townspeople from every corner of the settlement to see it, taste it, and weep a little, some of them, at the plain sweetness of water that did not carry the metallic tang of a failing creek. The boxcar itself, the rotting relic that Odessa had purchased for $3 desperate, remained her home through that first transformative year and for some years afterward, though it ceased to be a symbol of desperation and became, instead, something the town regarded with a kind of quiet reverence, the place where the truth had been found, sealed away and waiting, as though the land itself had been patient enough to hold its secret until the right person came to claim it. Children in Belhaven Junction grew up hearing the story of the railroad car in the spring, and more than one of them, in years to come, would say that it taught them something about looking twice at things the world had written off as worthless. It was a rusting boxcar behind a forgotten rail spur, condemned by the railroad and dismissed by everyone who passed it, that gave Odessavale a home when she had nowhere else to turn, and it was a patient, curious hands her mother had trained. Hands that knew to feel along a seam that did not belong, to read a wall the way one reads a face for signs of hidden trouble, that let her find, sealed within that abandoned car, the means to heal a whole town's quiet suffering. She had been cast out at 17 with $4.60 and a flour sack of belongings, told plainly that she was no kin to anyone and owed nothing by the world in return. And yet what she found, in the wreck of a stranger's forgotten betrayal, she chose to give away entirely, not because she did not need it, but because she understood, in her bones, what her mother had tried to teach her all along. That value overlooked by everyone else is not value diminished, only value waiting for someone patient enough to see it, and that the truest wealth a person can hold is a choice of what to do once they have found it. Odessavale remained in Belhaven Junction for the rest of her long life, and in time the town that had once nearly lost its water, its farms, and its future came to regard her not as a strange drifter girl who had bought a condemned railroad car, but as one of its founding pillars in truth, if not in name, a woman who had arrived with nothing and had chosen, at the first real test of her fortune, to make certain that no one else in her adopted home would ever again know the particular loneliness of having nowhere to turn. The boxcar stood on its spur for another 2 decades before the town, with Odessa's blessing, moved it to a place of honor near the schoolhouse, where it served for years afterward as a small museum of sorts, its false panel left deliberately open so that every child in Belhaven Junction could see, with their own eyes, the hollow space where an old wrong had been hidden, and where a young woman's patience had finally brought it into the light. Thank you for spending this time with Odessa's story, and with us. If it moved you even a little, we would be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that what looks worthless to the world is not always worthless in truth. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.